Hi everyone, welcome. I can see people are flooding in, so I'm just gonna smile and not wave because it's strange to wave at my own laptop. But welcome to this Sustain event where we'll be sharing our lessons from the Food Power Project programme on how to empower local action on food poverty. We're really excited to have you join us today and grateful for your time. I know it's a busy world out there. And still have a few people coming in, so I'll just continue to wait because we've got plenty of time, which is nice. Okay, so yeah, I think that we've got steady flow. So my name is Cecily Spelling and I am the Food Power Coordinator here at Sustain, and I've been in this role since September 2021, and I took on the role it's maternity cover for Maddie, who some of you may have worked with prior to my arrival, and Simon was the head of the Food Power programme, and he is on the call today, but you'll see his smiling face later. And there was also Ben Pearson from Church Action on Poverty. So yeah, welcome to this event. It's a Sustain event which has been very kindly funded by the 4 in 10 Child Poverty Network as part of London Challenge Poverty Week, where we'll be sharing a new report that we've written about the 10 lessons for empowering a local action on food poverty. So just a bit of information about who Sustain is and what we do. We are the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. So we're an alliance of over 100 members from across the food and farming world, and together we advocate for food and agriculture policies and practices that enhance the health and welfare of people and animals, improve the working and living environment, enrich society, culture, and promote equity. So the Food Power programme ran as part of the food poverty team at Sustain, and it ran between 2017 and 2021. And I'll fill you in a bit more about Food Power for those that don't know it when I do my presentation, but I think it's always important to start these webinars with a bit of housekeeping. So I know we've worked in the virtual world for a really long time now, and you're all very familiar with these, but just in case anyone's not, this is a Zoom webinar. So you can't see anyone's faces except mine and the other speakers when we speak. And for the Q&A, you'll be able to see us all at once. So you don't need to worry about turning your camera off or anything because we can't see you, but we can hear you via the chat box. So please do use the chat box to say hello and talk to each other. It's worth noting that on these webinars, the chat box automatically defaults to hosts and panelists. So if you're sending a message, do make sure to click everyone, because then it will go to all attendees and not just the hosts and panelists. Not that we don't want to hear from you directly, but just we don't want your messages to get trapped because we will be busy talking, so we may not be able to respond. There's also a Q&A box, which is where we'll be having, you can put your questions for the Q&A section. So please do feel free to whack questions in there now as they come up when people are speaking, and just make sure that you know, you're getting your questions answered. The panelists and I will come back to them in the Q&A, and if there's any that we miss or that we don't have time for, we'll try and write written answers to those. So do take a look. Oh, my voice is going. So do take a look at the Q&A box to make sure that you're asking your questions. There are closed captions, so if you need closed captions, they may be appearing, or they're appearing automatically for me, but I don't think they appear automatically for everyone. There's also the, it is being recorded, so if you know people that wanted to join today but aren't able to attend, or if you need to drop off early, don't worry, it will be recorded and it will be on the Sustain website in the next week or so, so don't worry about that. So I think that is pretty much the housekeeping out of the way. I think it's always nice with webinars when we can't see each other's faces to just say hello in the chat box and kind of introduce yourself with your name, your organisation, and one thing that you're hoping to get from today's session. I'd really love to be able to, you know where you're joining from today, and better understand what you're wanting to get from the session, so we can make sure that we try and deliver on that as best as possible. So please do use the chat box. I see that Liza already has, from 4 in 10 London's Child Poverty Network, who are hosting the London Challenge Poverty Week, which this event is part of. So do follow her example and yeah, use the chat box to say hello and kind of facilitate that conversation, because you know, we're still in this hybrid phase of face-to-face events and virtual events, and because there's such a big network for food power around the UK, it made sense to do this one online. But we don't want that to mean that you don't get to say hello to each other. So yeah, do use that chat box, and remember to click everyone rather than just hosts and panelists. Okay, so without further ado, I think I'll go straight into the presentation in that case. So whilst I just share my screen. Oh, and that is, we did this for practice run, it's never as smooth, but hopefully you can see that. And Simon, can I just make sure that you can see that and it's the right view, please?
Yeah, it's good for me.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Magic. Okay, so welcome to this food power event, a sustain event, focusing on our new report, which is all about 10 key lessons that empower local action on food poverty that we've learned through the Food Power programme. So, oh, this is where you try and change the slide and it doesn't do it perfect. So Food Power is funded by the National Lottery Community Fund and was led by both Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and Church Action on Poverty between 2017 and 2021. The programme aimed to strengthen the ability of local communities to reduce food poverty by developing solutions in partnership and with the support of peers from across the UK. So it's very much about learning and sharing, making sure that we're not recreating the wheel. The programme did this by supporting a wide range of actors from kind of community organisations, local authorities, public health officials, faith groups and others from across the UK to come together to form local food poverty alliances. These food poverty alliances would then be supported by a staff team to create food poverty action plans, empower people with lived experience to have their voices heard and have their say in shaping responses to food poverty, evaluating their local impact so we can understand what our collective impact is, so it's bigger than just our own individual projects, and also to give alliances and communities a chance to create innovative projects that transform the way people experience food poverty and access support. So we did that by offering a package of support in the form of a staff team, peer mentors, conferences, webinars, guides, toolkits, and lots more that you can see on this slide here, to kind of make sure that people were being supported with this work and really felt they were able to transform the way people were accessing support when living in food poverty. So this programme was a lot, you can see the stats and figures there, but this programme was so much more than just what is up there. And when I started this role in September, there is an incredible network of food poverty alliances across the UK, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England, from north to south, doing incredible things to challenge food poverty and to tackle its root causes. So, you know, these stats and figures shown on the slide are just a part of it, but there are so many more lessons that have been learned through these alliances, through the alliances work, that really help us understand what is needed to empower local action on food poverty. So I am very lucky to be here today kind of representing the Food Power Network, because this work was not my own, it was not Simon's, it was not Ben's, it was not Maddie's, it was the network's, in terms of kind of figuring out what really works to ensure dignified responses to food poverty and to empower real action. So I'm just going to run through our 10 key lessons with you, as well as some national recommendations. So first up, for anyone that knows the Food Power Network, I don't think you'll be surprised to know that our #1 lesson is that food poverty alliances and food poverty action plans are really powerful tools to empower local action on food poverty. They really help make sure that groups are collaborating and sharing their resources, maximising their capacity and kind of pooling knowledge. And when developing food poverty action plans, it makes sure that groups have a shared focus around agreed agendas and around a kind of agreed outcomes, and that is so powerful in ensuring that responses are effective and that they are coordinated and that they don't miss anyone or leave anyone behind. And this has become increasingly apparent throughout the pandemic when, areas that had food poverty alliances already had the infrastructure in place to jump into action and make sure that they were, supporting everyone that needed it. And because that collaborative approach has been so successful, alliances continue to develop now because they recognise that value of collaboration. So yeah, food poverty alliances and food poverty action plans have been one of the key lessons that's come out of Food Power, and that we hope that will continue to be a useful tool for people and communities as they work to tackle food poverty going forward. Next up, we've got local councils have an important role to play. So obviously a lot of local councils, and I know a lot of you joining here today will be from local councils, and you're already very involved in shaping responses to food poverty, and that has been a real challenge during the past 18 months. We know, but there's also a role to play in not just responding to food poverty, but also in tackling its root causes. And there's lots of ways that this can be done, and alliances have shown the opportunities that councils can take to get involved in this work. So for example, Harringay, that we'll be hearing from later, have funded a new role specifically to support their coordinated action around food poverty. And the Blackburn with Darwen, they're a councillor for the local area, chairs the alliance. Other local authorities have provided mapping support to map local food provision, and they've worked with local retailers, and they've built the alliance through various different connections. And because local councils have such an important role to play, we have an entirely separate guide on what local authorities can do to support recovery and resilience beyond COVID-19. So that is on our website, which I'll link to at the end. And for anyone that's interested, it's filled with lots of useful tips. So I would recommend taking a look at that. Next up, we've got amplifying the voices of experts by experience. Quite simply, no one understands food poverty like those who have experienced it themselves. And we can't really shape responses to food poverty without hearing their voices and making sure that their perspectives and their insight is built into design and delivery of projects. So we need to be making sure that we're giving people a seat at the table. To do that, we need to consider a number of factors, kind of how we engage them, what is what accessibility there is for people engaging. Are we providing adequate compensation for their involvement if they're having to give up time or having to give up work, or having caring responsibilities that they may have, and are we making sure that we're finding opportunities for them to engage in ways that they actually will enjoy and benefit from. So there's lots of work being done around kind of the different tools and opportunities to engage experts by experience and make sure that their voices are being heard. And alliances have done some really impressive work around that, with lots of support from our partners, Church Action on Poverty. And amazing things have happened as a result. So, some pictures here, we've got the Blackburn with Darwen Alliance, some youth activists that became involved in the alliance, worked together to develop the Darwen Gets Hangry campaign, because they were recognising that kind of child food poverty meant that lots of their peers were hangry when they went to the classroom because they hadn't been able to eat a sufficient breakfast or even a sufficient lunch throughout the day. And so they were trying to raise the profile of food poverty in the area, and even demonstrated in the local area to the MP's office. So that was very impressive. Church Action on Poverty have also worked with experts by experience to develop an entire book called The Same Boat, which is an anthology of poems on poverty and lockdown. And Luton Food Poverty set up a lived experience group, who experts from which went to talk at the End Hunger UK conference in Westminster. So, there's lots of ways that people can be involved, be that through designing their own campaigns, poetry, or sharing their voices in the Houses of Parliament. But it's important to make sure that those voices are heard, and we do all we can to amplify them. So next up, we have maximising family incomes. So obviously, one of the key causes of food poverty is a lack of sufficient funds. And to tackle the root causes of food poverty, people need sufficient income to cover the real cost of living. our social security net is one way of doing this, but there are other options on the table as part of this, and alliances and local authorities across the UK have done really impressive things to try and utilise those opportunities. So one example would be the Moray Council in Scotland developed their flexible food fund, which offered cash to residents that so they can, during lockdowns, rather than vouchers and rather than kind of food parcels, they offered a cash first approach. So residents could go and pay for the food they needed and wanted. And Oxford Good Food assessed the need for a living wage in Oxford, which helped to bring around the creation of the Oxford Living Wage. And there's also wraparound support that offers advice on what other financial support is available. So I know that a lot of alliances have worked with our friends, the Independent Food Aid Network, to develop a Worrying About Money leaflet, which provides some more detailed support around what other financial benefits might be available to people, aside from just a simple food bank, which is not always the answer. And there's obviously Healthy Start and the Best Start schemes in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and a lot of work has been done around promoting these schemes. So I think it is important, well, we found that it's important to be able to go back to basics and focus on maximising people's incomes rather than focusing on food bank provision, because when people are able to when people are able to access food in dignified forms, such as through Healthy Start, or by having more money through a better benefit system, or by being paid a better wage because there's a living wage in place, it's a much more dignified route to support and kind of financial freedom. And next up, we have that children can be supported for 365 days of the year. So every child has a right to food, but given capacity and competing demands, frontline service providers can often be uninformed of the causes of food poverty and the range of support available to children living in food insecure households. So there are a range of schemes in place for children: free school meals, the Healthy Start and Best Start schemes, holiday food provision, all of which are welcome, but not necessarily the answers to solving child poverty. But alliances have done really great work in making the most of these opportunities and promoting them far and wide. So, in the case of Healthy Start, alliances have done various different things to be able to support children through this scheme. So Cambridge and Leeds have both developed a Healthy Start veg box with local veg box providers. And you can see a picture of that. There's veg box in action there, being held by Becky from Cambridge Food Hub. And yes, so there's been lots of work going around that with Leeds and Cambridge, but Brighton also ran a promotional campaign, which you can see in the middle here, to help promote the scheme and increase uptake. And through that work, they actually found that through ward level data that you can access through the NHS, that there was one specific postcode area in the city that had an 80% uptake of the scheme, which was higher than anywhere else in Brighton and is probably higher than anywhere else in the UK, though don't quote me on that, which was all thanks to a receptionist at a children's centre who was really promoting the scheme to everyone that came in, had a huge display board advertising it, was having conversations with people. And it just shows the power of, by working with frontline service providers to kind of increase understanding, provide the resources they need to be able to promote it and to have a conversation about what the benefits are, it can really take off, which is precisely what happened in Brighton and Hove. And on the right here, the Healthy Holidays Good Practice Food Guide is from Leeds as well, where they've been able to develop specific guidance for holiday and activity and food programs to make sure that food being provided through holiday activities is healthy and giving children what they need. So there is lots of exciting stuff happening in this space, but ultimately, I think we definitely do support Marcus Rashford's calls for some changes as part of the End Child Food Poverty campaign. And we'd love to see Healthy Start extended to people, to everyone on universal credit, for example, as a starting point. So there's lots of work to be done at a national level as well to make sure that this works, but I'll get to the national recommendations later on. Community food projects can bridge the gap between food banks and financial security. So food banks, they are crisis support. They are, doing a good service for people that need them, but they offer little choice for people on low incomes, and they are a sticking plaster for a much more structural problem that we face in our society. Community food projects can go some way to bridging the gap between food banks and financial security, because through membership models and volunteering opportunities, they can create a sense of ownership for users and a bit more kind of financial stability by paying small fee every week. People are able to take away kind of £5 to £15 worth of food that they wouldn't be able to access in the supermarket, for example. A lot of these systems, a lot of these tools, well, you can see the list of different community food projects on the left-hand side. So there are a lot of different options, and alliances have worked through a lot of them and helped to kind of really lead the charge in setting these up. Lots of them do run on surplus food, and that is one thing that we would go forward with caution with, I think, because we would not want these models to mask the structural drivers of food insecurity and the broken food system that they are built upon. So some work has been done by alliances around the UK to use these stores and use these retail models as an opportunity to shorten supply chains, so they can work with local producers to provide healthy, affordable local food and make sure that it's accessible for everyone, not just people on certain higher incomes. And that's something that Sustain is very much dedicated to, and I know that lots of people in the network are too. So these models have played a vital role, especially over the last 18 months when more people have experienced food poverty than ever before. But there is a lot of work to do to make sure that they don't mask those underlying drivers of a broken food system. But that again comes back to national recommendations. So yeah, we're making the best of a broken system at this stage. We do have a guide that is a picture of our community food retail and food poverty guide, which goes into some of these topics in more detail and some of the examples, as well as some principles for developing your own community food retail project. So if that is something of interest to you, then again, you can find that report on the Sustain website. Next up, we've got language and food resilience. So I think it's quite easy to forget the importance of language, and I'm saying that as a comms person, but I think it is important to consider the role of language in our conversations around food poverty and household food insecurity. I mean, here you can see some of the words that people have at previous events have used to describe food poverty, and there's so many different words that we think of that are associated with food poverty that can be used to describe food poverty. And alliances have done a huge amount of work to show that terms can be interpreted differently. Some subtly put the onus on the individual, whilst others can encapsulate the need for systemic change, which is, one of the reasons why Food Plymouth have called their work around food poverty the Food Equality Project, for example. So, such words and language can have a tangible impact on the type of interventions that we put in place. And the support for such measures both locally and nationally. So it's important to be considering our language as part of our work, and that can definitely be something that experts by experience can help with, as well as different groups that are perhaps outside of our normal circle. And it's this focus on language that's really brought us to our use of the word food resilience, which is a term that Sustain and a lot of others are increasingly using, because we really want to build away from food reliance to food resilience. So we've done quite a lot of work through the Food Power programme to support alliances develop work that builds food resilience, and some of that work is shared in these photos. So for example, Foodwise Leeds worked with food aid providers in Leeds to figure out, to identify through webinars what resilience, what support is needed to create food resilience, and they created this really impressive toolkit which helps put down on paper the different pathways to independence and resilience. So it offers wraparound support, but it goes into far more detail than that. So that is available on their website if you'd like to look into it, and we recommend a read. And on the right here, we've also got young people from Hull who were taking part in a podcast and kind of sharing session to understand how they had experienced food poverty and what they would like to see going forward, which is helping inform the food poverty action plan. So the food poverty action plans can be purely resolving food poverty, but as part of that, it's important that they think about building long-term resilience as well. And that's very much what Hull have been doing by engaging young people in their work. So yeah, resilience has a really important role to play in the conversations and work around food poverty, because it does help put this work in the context of a whole food systems approach, really, because it cannot be talked about in silo, and that's what some of this work is showcasing. This is the penultimate one, a penultimate lesson, so please stay with me, but I think also it's really important to understand your collective impact. So food power, to help recognizing that a lot of communities were working through alliances and doing work collaboratively, we realized that there weren't many ways to be able to measure that work easily, and that projects and programs might have to be measured individually, which may not paint such a clear picture of how progress is being made around local action plans. So Food Power developed the Collective Impact Tracker in partnership with Cardiff University, which helps alliances understand the strengths of their work, the challenges of their work, and also the opportunities. So this has been really important for alliances to be able to understand their impact, basically, and refine their work to make sure that it is having the desired impact that they wanted, and actually making progress on their action plans. One really impressive example of this tool in action was from Middlesbrough Food Poverty Alliance, who used it to understand their strengths, their challenges and their opportunities, and identify that there was a bit of a gap in terms of grassroots support. So they actually worked together as an alliance to identify opportunities in the community to turn that around, and they worked together to find a base in a community that hadn't received as much support as others, and actually ran a unclaimed benefits check, where within one afternoon and across 3 days they'd managed to find £250,000 worth of unclaimed benefits from within that community, and worked with them to then support them to claim those benefits, which was an incredible effort for a relatively short amount of time. But they wouldn't have been able to do that if they'd not understood that they were missing certain communities and that certain specific support was needed. So that's important.
Cecily, I really don't want to interrupt you, but I think your slides are stuck on community food projects. A few people have raised.
Okay, so this was the understanding collective impact, which I think is where I was. And there is a guide on that as well. So if you want to go to the Food Power website, you can find that there. And then last but certainly not least is that targeted action is needed to tackle the disproportionate impact of food poverty. So the Trussell Trust found that 2/3 of users of their food banks had disabled people in their families, and we know that COVID-19 has also impacted. In fact, I'm now not seeing my slides, which is confusing, so bear with me, apologies. We do love a virtual event, don't we? So smooth. Okay, forgive me, sorry. Fine, okay, I'm back in the room, I can see things. Sorry guys, thank you for your patience. But yeah, so for example, the Trussell Trust have flagged that 2 in 3 households referred to a Trussell Trust food bank in 2020 included 1 or more disabled people. We also know that people with the immigration condition, no recourse to public funds, as well as those in the asylum system, are excluded from most welfare support, so are even more likely to experience food insecurity. And that's a big concern for many, and we do work on that at Sustain. So it's an important topic for us, but standard food provision doesn't always reach these communities. There's various different reasons for this, but Food Poverty Alliances have worked really hard to overcome those challenges, to provide targeted support where it's needed, and that's where the power of collaboration comes into play. We're connecting with organisations that might have relationships with these communities and different ways in, to make sure that the support being provided is actually delivering. So, for example, in these photos, for example, on the right, we have the Shah Jalal Islamic Centre in Cambridge, who are now part of the Cambridge Food Poverty Alliance. And they joined during the pandemic and were then supported by the Alliance to run weekly food hubs at their mosque, which was quite exciting and great for the community, because people definitely came out every week. Stockton-on-Tees Food Power Network also partnered with the Amal Project Teesside to support minority ethnic groups in the area to design and deliver a culturally appropriate food pantry, to make sure that communities were getting the food that they actually need and that is culturally appropriate for them. And the Interfaith Food Justice Network in Glasgow also brought together people from different faith and belief backgrounds to organised the One Big Picnic, which saw 2,000 people all share a meal in Glasgow, but to also respond to the Scottish Government's Good Food Nation consultation. So yeah, there have been some really exciting targeted approaches, and there's lots more learning to be done in that respect, but alliances have certainly made a start, and it's definitely something that should be considered as part of action on food poverty going forward. So just finally, we do also have some national recommendations. So I've obviously alluded in amongst those 10 lessons, some of which you may have forgotten by now, but that there's obviously only so much local communities can do, and resources really limited, and the responsibility of solving food poverty should not be on the shoulders of community organisations that are doing a lot of the work, and certainly did a lot of the work during the lockdowns and emergency food responses. So these things that national governments and funders and yes, regional authorities such as the GLA and the Greater Manchester, for example, things they can do are ensuring that where there are adequate wages and a secure social security safety net. So if we could follow Oxford's lead and make sure that your real living wage employers, and that you've identified what the real living wage needs to be in your community, and campaigning for the social security net to be sufficient. I know that we're all still shocked and appalled at the universal credit cut, and will continue to fight that, but it's precisely these kinds of things that are hampering progress. So it's important to make sure that we're all campaigning for that, but that national government actually does that. National funding and policies to support local action on food poverty. So if we're having these food poverty alliances, which are incredibly valuable tools to deliver support, whether these changes happen or not, they would still be useful. It's important to make sure that they are sufficiently funded, because capacity is a big issue, and that there are policies in place to support their work. Long-term responses should become the default, not short-term. We've seen throughout the pandemic that there were a few short-term responses to a much longer term structural issue, such as food parcels, huge amounts of surplus food use. These are obviously not the answer, and we by long-term responses we mean cash first approaches and going back to that social security safety net. Understanding our collective impact nationally is also something that we quite like to see. That it's been said that we haven't truly understood, or government haven't truly understood the impact of their cut to universal credit. So maybe there needs to be some collective impact of the cut to universal credit. The fact that Healthy Start eligibility is only really at 60% capacity, 40% of people are still missing out on average, as well as a whole host of other policies. Can these be measured collectively to really understand the impacts they are having and the opportunities to increase impact really, to make sure that they are actually serving people as they are intended. National government, local authorities should supporting a right to food. We know that some local authorities around the UK, Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester, are in support of a right to food. But this would be really great to make sure that it is in domestic law in the UK, and that's something that Sustain have campaigned on for a long time. And it's also making sure, finally, that food poverty is not discussed in silo to the wider food system. We really need a whole food systems approach to make sure that, you know, we're producing food fairly, everyone's being paid fairly throughout the food system, everyone's able to access healthy, affordable food, and that no one is left to go hungry. So, you know, a whole food systems approach will really help us get to that level. So it's important that food is considered in that way at a national policy level. So those are national recommendations and our 10 lessons from the report. We have a whole host of other reports on our website, including kind of how to develop food poverty action plans, webinars on all sorts of topics, many of the ones I've mentioned today, and these 2 guides that I've already shared with you. So if you'd like to access those, materials, then that's the website that you can head to. You can follow us on Twitter, and if you ever have any queries, then that's our email address. These slides will be shared on the website when I upload this recording, so you don't need to worry too much about noting that down, but obviously I can put it in the chat as well. I think I've talked for more than enough time now, almost half an hour, if not more, so I'm sorry about that, but I will hand over to Sam and Poppy from Haringey now before we then go into a Q&A. So Sam, Poppy, over to you.
Hi, thanks.
Hi, everyone.
Hey everyone, let me just queue up the slides. All right, Poppy, can you give me a check that you can see that?
Yeah, I can see just the slide, which is what we want, I think.
Wonderful. So hi everybody, thanks very much for inviting us to speak today about the Haringey Food Network. So my name is Sam. I'm the Haringey Food Network coordinator, and I work for the Bridge Renewal Trust, which is a local charity here in Haringey.
Hi everyone, just to echo what Sam's saying, thanks so much for having us. I'm Poppy Thomas, I am Haringey Council's voluntary and community sector coordinator. So we're going to speak a little bit today about our Haringey Food Network. So this started, and I was sort of involved in initiating this in May last year, and this was really bringing together kind of council colleagues and our voluntary sector and food providers during that pandemic to try and kind of coordinate emerging efforts to provide food to those experiencing food insecurity in Haringey. So prior to that, kind of conversations on sort of coordinating food work and those kind of strategic discussions about food poverty or food resilience, as Cecily was absolutely appropriately stating about the language, they were just sort of getting started, and so those conversations were beginning. But then during the pandemic, we saw a lot of community effort around food, and we saw a lot of new groups and initiatives getting started in response to needs that were being seen in our communities. Some of those were rising out of mutual aid, which was really emerging very strongly kind of across our borough. So we determined, we sort of identified within that a kind of need for some additional capacity, some dedicated capacity to try and bring together this work and do some of that coordination. And we saw also a real value in that role and in that capacity sitting within the voluntary sector. So it's for that reason that we funded and continue to fund this year our Food Network coordinator, Sam, who sits within the Bridge Renewal Trust, which is the council's voluntary sector strategic partner. So I think it's me on the next slide, Sam, just to say a little bit about the sort of need that we see in Haringey. So we had some information, we have, a wealth of information as a council around kind of poverty and income inequality within our borough, and particularly around kind of food. We had, of course, Sustain and Trust for London's 2017 report on Beyond the Food Bank, and that was identifying some key areas for kind of potential improvement, including that the borough would benefit from a food poverty action plan, from kind of increasing work around ensuring access for children to food 365 days a year, and around London living wage as well as kind of key areas. And we really have since then seen a lot of improvement in these areas, becoming a London living wage kind of employer and borough, and that being an ongoing process. But particularly as well with kind of holiday activities and food programme, what we've seen over the last year around that 365 sort of days of access to food for children is some brilliant partnership working between that programme and our food network. And so the strength of the network has been seen in how we've been able to provide that programme really kind of comprehensively across the borough in partnership. So with our council kind of pandemic response, as many other areas would have seen, it was a sort of humanitarian emergency response. So we did set up food hubs within the borough, and the information that we kind of gathered from that activity and that exercise kind of matched what we sort of already knew and perhaps could have predicted, which is that we were seeing the highest numbers of deliveries and kind of requests coming from sort of families and households in the east of our borough, with particular kind of wards over in the east really overrepresented relative to their kind of shares of the population, and that's kind of reflected in the little map there with the darker blue showing the kind of areas of highest demand. And what we also saw was that the reasons given for needing that kind of emergency food support really kind of varied across the borough and indicated varying needs. So we saw households in the east more likely to cite kind of financial reasons for needing support, whereas in the west households were citing sort of lockdown measures meaning they couldn't leave home. So that was perhaps indicating more kind of financial precariousness over in the east of the borough and more potentially social isolation in the west. Obviously that isn't a kind of rule, and there's clearly a kind of mixture. And we also saw a really strong correlation, and again, this will probably surprise no one here, between the kind of percentage of households in a given area who were receiving that emergency food support and the data that we already hold showing the proportion of the population in that area, and that is BIME, with that area's kind of index of multiple deprivation score as well, with the percentage of working age people claiming universal credit, and with percentage of children in low income families and on preschool meals. So we saw correlation with that across our areas within the borough as well. So within that, we knew that this kind of council direct support was really that emergency humanitarian response, and it wasn't going to be able to kind of continue indefinitely, and we wouldn't have the resources to do that. And that really kind of highlighted that need that I mentioned to coordinate our kind of community-led efforts and try and work together with those efforts. Probably about half of our kind of food network members and groups involved started themselves or kind of moved into providing food from what they were kind of previously doing during the pandemic. And I think what we've recognised, and in instigating the food network, what we're recognising is that we could have done more together with these groups during that initial response, but we sort of didn't have this coordination in place to do that. So really the aims then in bringing together that network beginning in May last year were in order to kind of give community groups the support to continue and to kind of collect that support together and collaborate to kind of bring in resources and share resources, and also to provide that kind of forum for knowledge sharing as well. And so we did that initially by instigating kind of monthly meetings, inviting our community groups and council colleagues, and really working a lot to kind of build those relationships and expand that network and try and reach out to across our kind of voluntary sector food providers in the borough and bring everyone together really. Hand over to Sam for our next slide.
Thanks, Poppy. So what has been achieved? I have to admit that in preparing for this slide, I had to speak to a few people and get their thoughts on what they felt was really important. So I thought I'd take you through a little bit of the journey really. In the beginning, it was all about alleviating food insecurity. That's what we did as a community. We came together to meet that immediate need during the pandemic. And as Poppy mentioned, we started to bring people together around these monthly meetings, which created an opportunity for dialogue. And having that dialogue on a regular basis in turn created an opportunity sort of for building trust, both between the groups, between each other, and also with the local authority. And then the local authority, as Poppy mentioned, decided to fund a coordinator's job, which was a massive step forward for us and has sort of enabled us to springboard, I think, ahead in a very short space of time. That I know that other networks really struggle to get that kind of funding in. So it was really important that that partnership and that collaboration with our local authority is highlighted here. So I started in September, and then very shortly afterwards, it was identified that that there was a need for me to go in and run the Central Food Hub. And the Central Food Hub basically got quite a few groups of our groups through the winter, in terms of making sure that they were receiving as many food supplies as possible that were available last year through FareShare, through Felix, and also directly through donations and through the local authority themselves. So we were able to distribute food in a coordinated and an equitable way, and that in and of itself was something that gave me an opportunity to build trust directly with the groups myself in my role as coordinator, through being on the ground with them, literally, and with my amazing team of volunteers who put in so many hours at the Food Hub last winter in a very cold church hall, which I'm sure a lot of you can sympathise with. So another part of my job was engaging more groups. And I think the Food Hub was a great start to all of that. And then as we came to the spring last year, we as a collective kind of really started to think and lift our eyes up, really, and started to think, hang on a minute, this is around to stay. We thought we were going to be at this for a few months, and now here we are. What are we going to do next? And that led us to think, let's get together, let's have a conversation about what we want next. And we, in July, had the Harrow Food Summit, which was a huge step forward for us, because it meant that instead of looking at the short term, what was in front of us day to day, we actually had an opportunity to think what we wanted for the long term. What do we want for our borough? What do we want for the residents that we're trying to help? And the Food Summit really solidified our desire to actually work together, our desire to effect change together. And we felt that, we're using the momentum really that came out of us coming together during COVID to collaborate going forward in the long term. And we now have, as a result of that, a lot of clarity around what our purpose actually is, that we didn't have previously. So it's about shifting the conversation from firefighting to the long term, and that's quite an exciting place to be in right now. Poppy?
Thanks, Sam. So Sam said a little bit there, kind of, it's really looking forward to our kind of what's next, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But just to kind of reflect on some of the challenges that I suppose we've seen in the sort of 18 months or so of sort of bringing this network together. I mean, a key thing, which again will surprise nobody, is that a lot of the sort of challenges that our kind of members within our food network see are and that they face in kind of supporting residents are obviously determined by the challenges that those residents face, which we've heard a good amount about from Cecily and about some of the really fantastic initiatives and responses that are being developed across the country. So challenges that kind of residents are facing might be around kind of actually accessing food banks, so being aware of what's available there, but also the kind of practicalities of kind of referrals and vouchers being required. And kind of in response to that, a lot of our food network members have a really kind of significant foundational approach that those kind of barriers will be removed as much as possible, and so sort of don't require referrals and vouchers, that sort of thing. But we also see challenges around kind of accessibility and kind of transport and actually getting to provision, and still ongoing demand kind of for delivery, which has become much more kind of difficult for the food network to provide, with people going back to work and so volunteer numbers reducing. I'm sure that's something that many people in the room will be familiar with. We've also seen, of course, as we've been talking about, that kind of real cost of living and the impact that has been seen on that historically anyway, but also the impact the pandemic has had on that, so on employment and on that kind of increased reliance on welfare benefits and what ability welfare benefits have to kind of cover the real cost of living, but also challenges where families and households have not got recourse to public funds as well. We see a real challenge in the kind of options around supporting those residents. I think also our food network members see challenges in the kind of variety of needs, so both kind of entrenched and quite long term, as well as kind of new, as it were, kind of food poverty and food insecurity. We also see challenges around kind of community and sort of mental health support needs, and the challenges of kind of alleviating isolation. I think for a lot of our Food Network members, perhaps that were around before the pandemic, quite foundational to their work was the idea of communities being brought together, and the challenges of doing that during the last 18 months will be kind of clear to us all, kind of losing out on that additional benefit that food can have and wanting to get back to that. And we've also seen, you know, gaps and kind of things, kind of reduction in what's kind of available in terms of resource after the end of the kind of shielded, clinically extremely vulnerable programme, and kind of coming into place in there and meeting that kind of need. But also really clear and a key priority for our network is that kind of need for wraparound sort of holistic support, and that speaks to all the sort of issues that I've highlighted there, and is wanting to go beyond direct food provision and address the kind of causes of people being in kind of food need. Network also faces kind of challenges around resourcing, so kind of sourcing and distribution of food. I think we sort of noticed the kind of coming to an end of sort of COVID related support with supplies. Our kind of network members, you know, have needs around kind of money in terms of resourcing as well, so kind of purchasing food that kind of goes beyond surplus, and I think that's a real priority for us in Harrow, going beyond kind of non-perishable food and providing fresh food as well. But we also have real challenges around kind of premises, and so access to community space, but also the other costs associated with running a community initiative, you know, around kind of insurance, equipment, and those sorts of things. But another kind of key issue I think I would class within resourcing is around time. So the capacity that our network members have to coordinate and to take the kind of time out to think strategically due to their kind of need to focus on their delivery. And that then has an impact on kind of time and capacity that's available to do things like sharing data, work on developing joint projects. So that in itself then leads to sort of challenges with this kind of point around joining up and support, which is another kind of key area. So really, you know, we see a lot of kind of need, and we sort of try and develop initiatives in the kind of space of mapping, so understanding what services are available, but also that work to kind of link up services is really important as well, and has in some ways been a bit of a challenge, and we're working to get better at that. Another one is around kind of communications. So I think one of the massive achievements of the network has been this kind of growing awareness of it as an entity, and of what's available in the borough. And so therefore what we see is services wanting to kind of use that link to residents to promote support services that are available, which is fantastic. But how can that best work is something that I think we need to address, and how do we manage that and prevent that becoming overwhelming and make sure that that link for communication is really useful and effective. And also challenges around trying to bring together our different areas and thinking around kind of whole food systems, bringing in food growing, bringing in public health aspects, linking, you know, with Healthy Start and kind of cash first initiatives. How do we kind of bring all of that together is another key challenge as well. So I think Sam's going to take us through some lessons learned.
Oh yes, lessons learned. Another tough slide. So what lessons did we learn? I think one of the key things, and I'm sure you'll all echo this, is that last year has really opened people's eyes to, and also how long it's staying with us. It's going to be staying with us. So many people were on the cusp of food poverty, and I think that's something that we all recognise now: the fragility of the workplace, the economy, and how quickly one can have a job one second and not have a job the next, and end up at a food bank asking for food. The other thing that we've talked about a lot is the fact that people are living in long-term poverty, and that fresh food is really, really important to be available in the borough, particularly at the food banks. But also that we recognise that we want to be moving towards a situation in the borough where people don't have to turn up at a food bank and ask for food. That ideally what we want is for people to have money in their pockets to be able to go and buy the food that they want with dignity. Having the clear common purpose, I think I've said this before, that is such a key thing. It has changed already the dialogue that we are having together, and is making us much more focused already, even though we've only just voted in our vision, mission, and our aims and objectives. So yes, having a clear common purpose is essential. Patience is another one. I think when I came into this in September, we had so much energy and so much ambition to do so much so quickly. You start to think about, you know, we did this again in July at the Food Summit. The problem is so big. It can be overwhelming. So you really have to set a realistic time target for yourself based on your capacity, the capacity of your groups, and yeah, be patient with yourselves about what you can achieve and in what time frame. Collaboration. We have to work together if we want to try to effect any kind of meaningful change. And that doesn't just mean with each other as community groups, but also with our local authority. You know, that collaboration that we have established over the past year with the local authority means that we are now being invited into into developing the food strategy, the borough food strategy with the council. You know, the impact of our work won't be felt immediately, but it will be felt. You know, some of the work that we're doing won't be felt for a while, but we have to start now. And we have to collaborate to do it. Communications, I think Poppy's touched on this already, but you know, something that's really stuck with me is that our community groups are doers. They see themselves as doers. They don't want to talk about the problems, they want to fix the problems. So when we ask them to come to monthly meetings or, you know, food summits and so on, it's really important to relate, you know, what we're talking about back to, you know, an immediate need or addressing immediate challenges. And then identify how that can be pulled into a more sort of strategic and big picture approach. Having an action after every meeting is usually quite a good thing, even if it's just something quite simple. The other thing is using the knowledge that's already out there, and this is where I do my nod to food power and sustain generally. You know, there are so many of us out there doing this work. You know, reach out, have a look at Sustain's website. There is so much information out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to help each other, you know, make these changes. So that's the lessons, or some of the lessons at least. What's next for us? I just wanted to share our now vision with you, which came out at the Food Summit through a lot of conversation. And I think a lot of you will recognise this, this statement. Everyone in Haringey should have equitable, easy, local and fair access to healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food of choice. So we've decided that in 3 months, we want to set up an organisation that has a constitution. That will be a membership body, basically, that will enable conversations, enable us to have conversations with other interest groups, you know, like waste and surplus groups. We've appointed a interim management committee, which gives us a bit of a structure as an organisation in order to be able to make decisions and coordinate our efforts. In 6 months' time, we want to be having our next Food Summit 2022, and we want to have created, or at least be near to finishing a year-long action plan. And in 12 months' time, i.e. this time next year, we want to be implementing that action plan. Our mission actually came out of conversation at the Food Summit. People said, all of the groups that were there and represented said that they wanted an end to food banks. So this is our mission, to eliminate the need for food banks and develop food as a positive means of connecting local people with support and to each other. So in 5 to 10 years, looking really far ahead, we don't want to see any food banks in Haringey. And that is quite a bold statement. Poppy.
Thanks, Sam. So I think it's up to me to finish off, and just to say that kind of from the sort of council's perspective, a key next step for us is that we are kind of undergoing work to develop a sort of overall borough food strategy, which will kind of link in with and kind of build on and go alongside, I guess, the kind of mission and vision of the food network, and the food network is kind of involved and a key part of the development of that. But it also brings in kind of other actors in this field, as I sort of mentioned, around kind of public health, around green and growing space, and around businesses, and looking to tackle kind of the whole food system that we have in the borough. I think a key part of that for me is around that growing wraparound support. So taking forward the Advice First Aid project, which the Food Network are developing, and trying to really make that a success and spread the learning and the practice developed as part of that out across the borough, to really promote that kind of integration with support across the borough, and developing links between services. So we want really the Food Network to kind of be integrated with kind of other council services and projects. So taking that forward, including kind of Here to Help, which is our sort of financial support initiative, including our local welfare assistance scheme. And so really we're kind of looking forward to working together with the Food Network and our other partners, bringing forward that food strategy, identifying those key kind of areas of priority and areas of work, to build food resilience in our borough together. Taking Cecily's really fantastic language there. So I think that's it from us. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you very much. I shall stop sharing now.
Wow, guys, God, that was so impressive. Thank you so much in there. And I'm sure, you know, the attendees do have questions. I've certainly got a bunch of questions, and I'm pretty sure yeah, it was really impressive. And I just think in terms of some of your lessons, I've gone for the lessons because that's what I was talking through. So it's just like, oh, lessons, so interesting. It was all interesting. But I think your point around communication, Sam, was a really interesting one, because obviously I talked about language, but I talked about language in terms of like the language that we use, but not necessarily then how we communicate that. And I think there's two different sides to that coin. That's a really important one, to make sure that, you know, we are communicating it. Because I know when I talk to some of my friends about what I do, they're like, oh right, so you know, we want to give more food to food banks. I'm like, actually no, like it's communicating the mission as well. And I think language is part of that, but maybe it's a bigger story. And then also I think your point around patience is a really interesting one, because I know that one of the examples that we use in the report that I didn't have time to talk about here, but was that Lancaster Food Poverty Alliance started their food poverty action plan in 2018, and they launched it in Feb 2021, I think. So it wasn't an easy process, because there's so much chopping and changing, because you want everyone to be involved, and because it's such a journey. And it is really, you know, I think we all can come into this space thinking, I'm going to get stuff done, but actually to take a step back and have that patience is really brave and powerful thing to do. So yeah, and I also think that relates to burnout, which we know it is not included in our report because we focused on the more kind of immediate things that you can do, but it is definitely an underlying concern for many in the network. I know that patience is not easy, and when you're doing so much important work that you're passionate about and you're seeing the repercussions of it, I think personal resilience is also really important, and patience comes into that. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on kind of personal resilience when you're doing this kind of work. But before we do that, I thought I'd just come to Simon, because obviously Simon's managed the Food Power programme for the past 4 years and was key to, you know, creating it really. So Simon, I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on any of the things that have been discussed, or wanted to add any thoughts about kind of what Sustain are up to at the minute and next.
Yes, thanks very much, everybody. And sorry, I had a complete tech failure and had to start using a different computer. Cecily and I aren't in the same place, but seem to both be having similar problems. So yes, I mean, I don't want to repeat anything that the three of you have really excellently covered already. And thanks to Cecily for sort of trying to make sense of all the information and experiences we've gathered over the last 4 years, and sort of downloading stuff from my brain that hasn't been easy necessarily, I don't think. And yeah, I think just from the sort of Sustain perspective in terms of what next, we're particularly relevant to today's meeting. We are, with Food Matters, running what's called the Food Routes Incubator on behalf of the GLA, the Greater London Authority, which is supporting 10 food partnerships, of which the Harrow Food Network is one. And I guess in terms of learning from Food Power, we're we're supporting those 10 partnerships in a more intensive way than we did support alliances and partnerships during Food Power, just because we're only working with a cohort of 10. But that's not to say that we're not going sort of as far as we would like to, perhaps, in terms of we are providing we've got some experts coming in, we're able to provide a level of one-to-one support, but I think there's certainly more that we want to try and do as Sustain to kind of move a bit beyond the webinar. Webinars are great, but I think there's probably demand, as long as there's capacity to get involved, for us to take sort of a more structured learning process, whether that's around communities of practice or bringing people together as we did during Food Power, whether that was offline or online. But I do think that we're just trying to think about different ways that we could structure that and offer that in a way that appeals to people, because we're very conscious that some people have more time to engage with our learning and webinars and beyond that, and others, particularly sort of those working really hard in communities very much on the front line, who we do want to be able to reach in some way. They don't necessarily have lots of time to engage with lots of events, etc. And we are working on 2 other research projects, one that's again with the GLA and a team from Oxford University around food resilience in London, and that there's been a research process and a report will come out from that before the end of the year. We're also involved in the responding to food vulnerability during COVID-19. We've just run 4 workshops, of which some of you might have attended, to try and update on understanding what the current situation is in terms of the response to food insecurity, what lessons have been learned from the pandemic, acknowledging, of course, it's not finished, and kind of what that means for councils' roles in particular. That's come out a lot in terms of greater understanding, perhaps, of some of the challenges, and there were some examples that are coming through of greater long-term commitment to supporting the work of food partnerships, food poverty alliances and others. I think there are some real challenges for us to Sustain around involving people with lived experience, and representing and reaching more diverse communities, and challenges in the healthy sense. I mean, I think in terms of empowering experts by experience, Church Action on Poverty led on that during the Food Power programme, but we as Sustain want to do more of that, but we are, by our nature, slightly removed from working directly with people in communities generally. But so I think there are some challenges for how we do that, but it's definitely continuing to work in partnership to think about what role we can play. And I think thinking about creative ways, diverse ways that we can involve people at different levels of projects, but also, I guess, support those we are working with to do that. And I think as Sustain, we need to find some more ways forward to do that ourselves, rather than perhaps relying on an organisation like Church Action on Poverty, who were great partners for the programme, but I think that meant we didn't take on so much of our learning and action ourselves. And I think in terms of diversity, we just want to make sure that we are genuinely reaching out to people as we think about our new ideas for future work, and that's built in from day one, because I think we found it's quite hard to sort of retrofit reaching lots of different communities if you haven't been thinking about that as much as you should have from day one of the programme. And I think there are some particular challenges around certain communities, whether that's people with no recourse to public funds because of their immigration status, disabled people, older people, people leaving care, all sorts of different groups, that we need to somehow recognise that diversity and build that into our future work, I think. So I'll stop there.
So much. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, lots of other stuff happening in the Sustain world that people can, explore on our website, and hopefully there'll be other opportunities for people to get involved. But Sam, Poppy, I would like to come back to you on the question. Well, I don't think we've got any questions in the Q&A, but attendees, please do, if you've got questions, you put them in the Q&A, or I will let you put them in the chat box, and we will still let that be answered. So yeah, do use that, do use us. But I would like to come back to you, Sam and Poppy, around the question around resilience, because I know that you've already talked about it, both that the last winter was not an easy one. So if you don't mind sharing, because I realise it can be a bit of a personal question, but how have you looked after your personal resilience? And do you have any reflections on that kind of coming out of the past 18 months where maybe you actually weren't able to look after your personal resilience? Any advice for people that are in the kind of similar field would no doubt be welcome.
You want to go first, Poppy?
I can try, and yet, Cecily, as you've sort of alluded to there, I think it's a really important, but it's a really hard question to answer, isn't it? I think my sort of main thing I would say, my reflection on it is, I think about if we kind of hadn't put the effort in and the work that we've put in to kind of bring together food providers in the borough, and if we'd all been sort of squirreling away, as it were, and I say all, I'm including myself in this, when really it's around kind of our community food providers who are kind of part of our network, and those who aren't part of our network as well. If we'd all sort of been squirreling away without communicating with each other, then it would have been even more difficult. So it's just the power of kind of sharing, both for the kind of benefit of what you're trying to do and actually be able to achieve more collectively than you would singly, but also you know, understanding that you're kind of not alone and you're part of a bigger well, literally network in this case, of groups, of organizations, of, you know, tiny little grassroots projects, all recognizing the same sort of things and wanting to work together to address them. So that kind of benefit of sharing, really, and kind of coming together is a really kind of key one for me, I think. But also probably another one I would cite is combining a kind of focus on what you want to achieve, and really trying to get to a kind of shared sense of purpose in doing that kind of collective work, which is what the Food Network has been able to do over the past few months. But balancing that kind of what do we want to focus on, where do we want to get to, and having that collective vision with recognizing what you have achieved as well, and taking the kind of wins, for want of a better word, when they do come, and so reflecting on what's gone well, really, and what has been positive, and what the strengths of your kind of partnership are, I would say would be my two key things. Sam, anything to add?
So I echo a lot of what Poppy said there. I would also say for me, it's been very much about drawing strength from the volunteers and the people that I've been working with. They are an inspirational bunch, and so I draw strength from that. You know, and also from seeing them work. So, you know, my time at the Food Hub, and I still do it now, which is to go and visit some of the groups when they're open, when they are interacting with their communities. And I think seeing them work and seeing and meeting the residents is something that is very important for me to keep going. I suppose there's that. And also remembering that I do need to stop working at some point in the day, and taking that time and not feeling guilty about it was a very, was for me something that was an important learning step after I took on this role. It's quite a different job than I've had before. And you do feel like you just can't do enough. And then at some point you do actually remember you're a person too, and you need to look after yourself in order to keep helping other people. So those are my things about personal resilience.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you both. Simon, I know that you've obviously been doing other things on this as well. Is there anything that you want to share?
Sorry, there is a question. Shall I answer that?
Yes, go for it.
I don't know if you'd seen. So just in case anyone hasn't seen it, Theodora is asking, I'd love to hear a bit more about what you just mentioned, Simon, about centering people with lived experience in the work. What did Sustain Church Action on Poverty members implement through the programme that worked, and what would you do differently? There are some case studies on the website that provide a bit more detail than I can provide now, but sort of 4 different examples that come to mind now are where in Oxford they decided they wanted to establish a food poverty alliance. I think that decision was made with people with lived experience, but importantly, the decision was made to get people with lived experience into a group that would to become the alliance, and then it was actually them that invited professionals or practitioners, for want of a better phrase, to come round the table with them rather than the other way round, which is obviously the norm, and I totally understand why it's normally the other way round, but I think there was something about Experts by Experience really owning their food alliance in Oxford, because they'd started it and they were the founding members. I think that was very powerful. In Plymouth, in both Plymouth and Blackburn with Darwin, different creative tools were used to engage people, whether that was particularly sort of photo voice work in Plymouth. Blackburn with Darwin, the Food Resilience Alliance there helped develop the tools with the Leapfrog team based at Lancaster University, different ways to talk about food, have conversations about food that are sort of quite iterative in how they're used, not about stigmatizing people's situations, just about having conversations with people, and also walking around people's local areas, doing food safaris and tools to record that. I think that's sort of, I learned a lot from that, in terms of you obviously can't just sit people down and ask them to tell you everything, but also actually by using tools you actually get a lot, sort of a much more richer conversations, I think, that perhaps feel a bit like you're going round in different ways to get to the destination, but you're in a much better place once you do get there, I think. And then in Newcastle, the Alliance there had regular meetings with people with lived experience, and there were agendas for those meetings. I sat in on one. There was a sense of purpose for being there, but it was also a time to come together, chat and catch up, and vent frustrations, personal or otherwise, as well as think about different ways they could influence the council. And some of those members took on some other activities, whether at the local or the national level, to try and influence policy, whether that was the local financial inclusion group convened by the council, or getting very involved in national level campaigning. So those are just 4 examples, but I'd really urge anyone to have a look at the case studies we have in the food power section of the Sustain website that highlight just some of that work, including the toolkit that was benefited from some of that learning.
Oh, you're on mute, Cecily.
It's crap.
Oh, she's back on mute.
I was going to come in on lived experience as well, while Cecily's sorting out her sound. I think a lot of our groups, if I may pick up one of our groups, Community Cook Up, based in Northumberland Park, who actively, and they're not the only ones, who actively encourage people with lived experience to become a volunteer at the during their activities. And so most of their volunteers are people who